Welcome back to Global Crossroads. I'm Bryan Hull, and most of our guests are from the local community, people who teach or work at the college. But I have to say, I think that our guest today has now broken the record for having come the longest, journeyed the longest to come for Global Crossroads. So this is Professor Ming-Bao Yue from the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And she teaches many different things, but I'll just talk about a couple. Chinese literature, film, comparative literature, ethics, women's studies. I could go on. So welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
And so let's start in the beginning. Why don't you tell us where you were born and where you grew up?
I was born in Hamburg, Germany. And I spent all my life there, and I completed my secondary and primary education in Hamburg. And I studied 2 years at the university, where I majored in sinology and German literature, contemporary German literature.
And where were your parents born?
My parents are both from Yangzhou, which is a city in central China, and it's sometimes referred to as Little Beijing because it was the capital during the Tang Dynasty. And they're both from Yangzhou, but my father grew up in Shanghai, and my mother spent her first 8 years in Shanghai, and then she grew up in Wuhan.
And how did they end up in Germany?
Well, they met in Hong Kong. They both left China before the communists came, and they met in Hong Kong, and then they had an opportunity to go to Germany. And I think because of the situation in China, a lot of people from China left and went to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was a little bit overflooded with people living. And so my father had an opportunity, work took him to Germany, and they decided to go there for a couple of years. But then they had children, and then once you have children, school starts, and it's more difficult to move. So they decided to stay.
And at that time, how many immigrant Chinese were there in Hamburg?
Very, very few. In fact, it was a very, very small community, and because during the Nazi period, the couple of Chinese who lived in China ended up in concentration camp. I did actually some research on it. I wrote a paper entitled "On Not Looking German," because a lot of people always ask me, where are you from? So I have to explain, I was born and raised in Germany, and a lot of people say, you don't look German. So I wrote a paper, and I did some research into looking at how did Chinese people end up in Germany and what happened. And I found out that during the Nazi period, a lot of them ended up in concentration camps, and then after that they left. And so in the late 40s until the mid 50s, there were early 50s perhaps, very few Chinese there because of that experience they had. But then slowly Chinese people, went to Germany. A lot of them actually through Italy. I don't know why. And so when my father went there in 57. It was a small, tiny community, of Chinese people. There was no Chinatown, but there was one street in the sort of typical red light district that was referred to as Chinatown, but actually only consisted of one shop, or 2 shops maybe.
Wow.
So that was it.
And what was it like? What was, I don't know, a polite way of saying is, how was racism at the time, and you growing up being a Chinese person?
My mother always, she didn't speak the language when she first went to Germany, so she always felt it was very difficult. And but my experience of growing up was actually it's a different form of racism, because I always felt that I was at school the only foreigner, right? The only foreign, looking face in my school. So I was always singled out. And I was always made to feel very different, and people would always ask me about Chinese culture and things like that. So I always felt like the monkey in the zoo. Everybody knows you, but you don't know anybody. And they always asked me, to speak about Chinese culture. And I was lucky enough to have had a mother who was very interested in Chinese culture. My mother was very into Peking opera.
Oh,
and
wow.
she learned how to sing when she was in China. And so in the weekends, we had a little group of Chinese people come to our house and sing Peking opera. And so I grew up with a lot of traditional Chinese culture and music.
Fortunately.
Yes,
so then
fortunately.
You could give an answer
So
when
I
you
could
were
give
asked.
an answer. But I always felt, I also know a lot about Germany because I was born and raised here. And yet I was never allowed to feel German. So it was different. I wouldn't say it's a form of racism, but it's a form of othering, what I would
Right.
call, or making you different.
Huh. And when was the first time you went to China?
I went to China, so I started at Hamburg University, or University of Hamburg. I majored in sinology and German literature. And because I was already fluent in the language and in the culture, I went straight into the third year of the sinology program. And I took mostly content courses. I didn't have to do any language courses. And also, I think I should mention that throughout my upbringing in Germany, I attended a community-based weekend school where I learned to speak Mandarin and learn how to read and write. So it's sort of these community schools are usually run by the Taiwanese government, who are trying at that time in the 40s and 50s to compete with the communists to sort of organize the overseas Chinese. So they would send government representatives operating these travel agencies in different European cities, but then task was also to try to organize the overseas Chinese and to teach them about Chinese culture, and then of course about the nationalist government, about Taiwan, and do their bit of anti-communist propaganda. But that's how I basically learned Chinese, and to keep up with the language and culture. Right? And so I went to university. I went straight into third year, and then I quickly realized in order for me to progress, I needed to go to a Chinese-speaking country, either Taiwan, Hong Kong, or China. And we don't have any relatives in Taiwan, and my father was always very anti the nationalist government. And so he said, you could go to Hong Kong or you go to China. So I went to China. I went to Peking University.
And so you're at Peking University, and you're obviously around a lot of students who were born and raised in China. Did they sense in very quickly and in subtle ways that you were different than them?
In some ways, I would say yes, because because I wasn't familiar with what happened in China at that time, right? Because up until the Cultural Revolution, which ended in '75, and China really sort of opened up in '79, right? Contact between China and the rest of the world was very limited, and my parents had very limited contacts with our relatives. Of course, you hear things, but you don't know anything firsthand. So they realized very quickly that I wasn't raised in China because I didn't know some of the historical facts or events that took place in China. But they couldn't tell really from my accent.
Or how you acted.
How I acted. Well, of course, in those days everybody wore Mao suits.
Right,
so, but I got my own set of Mao suits and I made pigtails. But I was wearing jewelry, just like little things, earrings. They could tell.
That they would look at.
They could tell, yes.
Yeah.
And but I could also get away. Pass with because my Chinese was very fluent. But as soon as it got to topics, because their knowledge of the outside world was also very limited. So within the short conversation, people could tell I wasn't raised in China.
This is all fast. This is one of the reasons why I wanted you to come, because you have not the traditional.
Right.
Yeah, it's very, very
And the other thing was also very interesting is because I was raised abroad, as an overseas Chinese, although I don't really like that term, my upbringing was in many ways a lot more traditional than that of my classmates. So we're brought up under the communist government, and and a lot of the old traditional Chinese values were considered to be bourgeois and feudal. And so just very simple things, for example, form of address was comrade. Right? And I wasn't used to that. So when I first went to China, I was brought up with using the proper title, Mr. and Mrs. and so on. And I was very, courteous and friendly. And my teachers noticed that. And everybody would say that, I was a lot more Chinese.
But that's always the case. The immigrant family holds on to the values, and things change back at home. And
and that's particularly true for Chinese people, I think, and also I think if you during my generation, people like me who were raised in Europe, because Europe is not at that time wasn't such a hospitable country. It never considered itself as an immigrant country. It was in some sense very anti-foreign, anti-immigrant. So growing up as an immigrant in Europe, you have to hold on to your own culture. Whereas in America, it's the opposite, right? America prides itself as being immigrant country.
Right, assimilate.
And assimilate. So I remember my father had some friends who came to America rather than went to Europe, and they were visiting us in the late 90s, and the whole family came, and he had 2 daughters my age. And I started speaking Chinese with them, and they couldn't speak any word of Chinese. And I was so surprised. And that's how I got interested in the history of Asians and Chinese in this country. And I read Maxine Hong Kingston, and I learned about the Exclusionary Act, and I learned about this assimilation. But I was very surprised that they couldn't speak a word of Chinese.
Right,
so I had to speak English with them. So that was good for me to practice my English.
So you end up at University of Hawaii. Did you live anywhere else in the U.S. prior to that?
Yes, I did my MA and PhD degree in Chinese literature at Stanford University. And I also did a PhD minor in comparative literature at Stanford. So I lived in California for 10 years before I came to the university.
So, as you know, I went to Honolulu for the first time last summer, and I felt as if in some ways I wasn't in the U.S. anymore. Like, in some ways it was obviously the U.S., and in some ways it felt very, very different, like a different country. So you come with this background, this very unusual background, and then you enter Hawaii, and I wonder what that was like culturally for you. Was it an easy transition or not? What were some of the challenges?
I think it was good that I went to California before I went to Hawaii, because I really liked California because of the Asian population and because Asian culture there, I think, is also very widespread or prevalent in California. So I liked that. It was a good transition. And then I went to Hawaii, and I like the fact that as an Asian, you're not a minority. In fact, if you're Caucasian, some people say you're a minority, but I think it's about 50-50.
Is it?
I think it's about 50-50, yeah. So I like that, and growing up in Germany, when you're a foreigner, you're channeled into certain professions, or because it's still very difficult, there's still a lot of institutional racism, and you see foreigners or non-Caucasians concentrated in certain professions. So that was very different when I came to this country in California, where Asians are represented in most professions. And in Hawaii, they are the majority. So that was a nice feeling. I like that. But I think being in California, having lived there for 10 years, helped with that, transition.
Very interesting. Okay, so you, prior to coming, we talked about, and I asked you what you were passionate about besides teaching literature and film and all those things, which would be obvious. And you talked about the politics around the humanities, sort of like in recent years, the sort of lack of attention and authority that's been given to the humanities. And in talking prior to today, you said, well, actually there's hope that maybe humanities are coming back into prominence. So just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm passionate about humanities, obviously because I teach literature, and I've always been, I always believed in the humanities. And I think humanities should be the core of any university education. And I think they are the hope for the future, or what Stuart Hall, he just passed away, and he's referred to it as the founder of cultural studies. Right. He calls common humanity. Right, so I think humanities, the old core, that formed the humanities. As you know, for many years in academia, and particularly humanities, was a bad word, right? And that was because a lot of people said it referred to dead white males. But now the word has become more global, international, intercultural, and and I think people are beginning to think about humanities in a broader sense. And humanities, the old notion of humanities as it was known in the West and as part of the university education, there's a need to infuse that with sort of non-Western values, right? So Stuart Hall is my hero, said, humanities, common humanities, that's what we need to build. And as I said, I believe humanities should be the core, the foundation of any university education. And I think in this country it's usually referred to as the liberal arts education at the undergrad curriculum.
Right.
And I've been sort of following the development of higher education in this country. And I think in the last maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there's been a shift away from liberal arts education into skills training and channeling students into professional schools as early as possible, right? And maybe there was a need, 20 or 30 years ago to sort of do that. But I think now, from many of the materials that I read and the debates I'm following on what's happening in college and higher education, the tide is turning. I think the tide is turning. And recently there was the American Academy's Commission for the Humanities and Social Science, they released a report. It's called The Heart of the Matter, the Humanities and Social Science for a Vibrant, Competitive, and Secure Nation. And this report was sponsored by Senators Lamar Alexander, Mark Warner, and Representatives Tom Petrie and David Price. And the purpose of this report was to develop a report or start a dialogue nationwide to talk about the importance of the humanities and social science to the future of America.
So why do you think this report even came into existence? Like, what prompted it?
Okay, I think what prompted it is that after 30 years of higher education becoming very narrow, very skills-oriented, I think a lot of employers, this is what I hear, find that students don't really have the skills to survive in a world that is competitive, becoming more global. American students, right? And so I think they realize, a lot of employers, at least I know from Hawaii that's the case, they complain that our undergrads don't know how to read and write, they don't know how to think, right? And they don't know how to navigate interpersonal relations. And these are the things that are typically taught in the liberal arts education, because the liberal arts education teaches values. It's not focused on skills, right?
Interesting.
And in fact, I think in 2011, there was a conference at Stanford University, and David Horowitz, who is the director of engineering at Google, but also what they call it philosopher in residence, he gave a speech at that conference at Stanford. I don't know what the conference was, but it was reported somewhere, and I read about it. And he said he would rather hire more PhDs in humanities than somebody with a special degree in engineering.
I remember that.
Yeah, do you remember that?
Everyone was talking about that.
Yes.
Around here.
Right. And then, so I thought that was, that was very good, because after 10 years and working in the industry, he said he realized all this technological skill he had acquired didn't really equip him very well to deal with larger issues to move the company ahead, right? And then the other book that I would like to mention, and that many people talked about, I think it was also released in 2011, is Academically Adrift. Have you heard about it?
I remember that.
Yes, yes. And in that report, it said very clearly, I think they mentioned that people. This was done by, I think, one professor who was in sociology from NYU, and the other professor, I don't know where he was, also in sociology, and they collected data on undergraduate education and graduation rates and satisfaction and so on. They also, I think, interviewed employers.
Mm-hmm.
And the conclusion was that students who had a degree in liberal arts are, comparatively speaking, better equipped to deal with the outside world. You know, they know how to think, they know how to read and write, they know how to deal with interpersonal relations. And the ones that were most, in their opinion, poorly equipped for the workforce were the ones who had a degree in business, you know, engineering, and professional skills.
In one of my classes that I'm teaching now, we're talking about causation versus correlation. And I wonder, as I was listening to you, I was like, well, maybe it's just the people who go into the humanities from the outset, the kind of people who would go into the humanities would lead to certain strengths and values. And if you suddenly try to move people who aren't necessarily predisposed to embrace the humanities, like if business majors are like, okay, I want to become a humanities major, that it actually wouldn't work because it's somewhat artificial. You see, what you've pointed out is a correlation that people who graduate with this degree, they do very well, but we don't for sure know it's the degree that's producing them doing very well. You see what I'm saying? So I'm just a little. I think it's great evidence, but then I don't know about that.
Well, you know, I think part of that is maybe, I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but I think, you know, the whole idea that you get an education and that an education is for public good, it is also to make you a better person, right? This is actually what I think higher education was always about, right? It has moved away to, particularly in this country, to say that education is something to make money and for your individual benefit. And I think the debate needs to move back to education is something it teaches you values. It makes you a better person. It makes you a better citizen, right? It makes you more responsible, right? It's not about making money, but you can make money, right? And you can actually go into different profession. It's not so narrow, it's actually much broader, right? With a degree in English, you are very useful in many, many different disciplines because you know how to read and write, right? And in fact, but the professional training narrows you down. And when a lot of people say it's market force and all this, well, that's precisely because at one point a certain kind of skill becomes popular, but then the tide may change, right? And then those skills may no longer be useful.
Right.
So in fact, a liberal arts education is, on the long run, a much better deal because it gives you the skills to survive in the world. Plus, it teaches you values that really, I feel, should make you a better person, right? And makes you a better citizen.
Yeah, right? And in the end, actually a better worker, I think.
Yes.
Because you're aware of like fairness.
Yes.
And you try to do what is right. And in the workplace, and you realize when someone is doing something that's ethically dubious, and you tend to disengage and all these.
And that's exactly what I hear from many of my friends in Honolulu who are not in the academia, but who are lawyers, who are doctors, or who work in the industry. And they tell me, they always ask me, what are you guys doing at the universities? These students, they don't know what ethics is, they don't know what's right, they want to be spoon-fed. I tell them how to do something, their work ethics is bad. And so it is actually coming from the market force, now this, I think there is a general sense now, after 30 years of training our undergrads to be very narrow, very professionalized, and they have skills, but they don't have the right values.
Right, and it's, there's all those statistics about how often someone will change professions throughout their lifetime. And so that's why you need a broad set of skills, because you're going to keep shifting throughout.
Right.
So I wonder if there's actually a line that connects all of this. Like, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, that person that grew up in Hamburg with a strong sense of values, and that you ended up really being a champion of the humanities and ethics and values. I wonder if there's a connection that, if you would go all the way back, it would make sense that someone who started out where you were, that you'd end up where you are now.
Well, I think the fact that my parents ended up in a different country and saw the importance of, teaching us Chinese culture, and as I say, the fact that my mother was very musical, very into reading and picking opera, So I think those are important. I think culture is very, very important. It's a core of the humanities, right? And my parents would never, there's a stereotypical view of Chinese parents always wanting their children to make money and wanting them to end up in science and engineering. My parents were not part of that.
Well, my stereotype is like, what you just did isn't good enough. Like, you have to do more.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if you're gonna play the piano, like, you have to play better.
Yeah, I did. I learned how to play the piano. I did.
See, some ways.
So some things too. But I think also because maybe because we were an immigrant family and we had to keep very, we were a very close family because we were not at that time. I wasn't growing up in a culture that was very hospitable.
Right.
So
that's what I wonder, if there was a connection.
We were, very close family, and
like, you had to establish a sense of values.
Yes.
Whereas if you'd been really mainstream German, you would have just been like, oh, I'm just kind of living my life,
But I would say, education in Europe has always been much more, sort of the emphasis on public. Education, as you know, in Germany, in Europe, for the most part, is still free. Right? Education is still important. You don't have to pay to go to college. Right now, you have to pay a little bit fee. So so education is free. Education has always been important, and I learned a lot of what I consider now, what I see now in hindsight. I didn't know it then, but democratic values imbued in my education, and it was very much a liberal arts education, right?
Well, we could probably talk. And we just scratched the surface of all of these topics, but I think we'll keep talking, and I want to thank you for coming to Portland. Your first time here?
My first time here. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I really like the city. It's beautiful.
Okay, thank you for tuning in for another episode, a very stimulating episode of Global Crossroads.